Okay. So welcome everyone to the UCLIC seminars series. Today we're privileged to hear from Cara Wilson. I was lucky enough to do my PhD alongside Cara at QUT, Queensland University Technology in Australia. And she's one of the reasons I got my PhD. So I'm very thankful to her, and I'm thankful that she's able to come here today. So she's also, you went to the University of Glasgow first, and now she's at the University of Edinburgh, and she's one of the co-founders of the, what is it called?
Children Interaction and Design Group.
Excellent. Yeah. So she's going to be presenting her research to us today, and looking forward to it. Turn the time over to Cara.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Thanks everyone for having me. Really happy to be here. And yes, so I'm going to be talking today about my work called CoDesign Beyond Words, exploring digital and tangible, although focusing more on the tangible for this talk, technology design in neurodiverse classrooms. And as Jeremy said, so I'm a lecturer in children and technology, newly started. I've only been in the lectureship about a year, so it's quite an exciting time to be thinking about how to develop some of these ideas and take them a bit further forward. So if anyone has any ideas, feel free just to start the chat afterwards. It would be great to hear what you think. And I'm in the Centre for Research in Digital Education, which is in the Institute for Education, Community and Society at Edinburgh University. Okay, so as a bit of sort of general framing, what I like to think about in my work is that technology is increasingly pervading the lives of children. So all too often, kids are really left out of the conversation about how design infiltrates their lives. And particularly different types of new emerging technologies. And what the principles, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the principles of participatory and co-design try to do is to suggest that the people for whom a technology are intended should be included, and I think, and many people think, foregrounded in the design of that technology. So the sort of core concept of this work is that design should be done with, not for children. And even to some extent, trying to move towards design being done by children, which is another story as well. And it's kind of quite clear that children's exclusion from these design processes are never more apparent than when it comes to children with additional support needs. So particularly those who don't communicate in traditional ways. So children who don't communicate in traditional ways are often deemed as maybe too challenging to work with. And a lot of the time, they're just really not included in design processes. So I would hope that lots of people would think, actually, that's really not the case at all. It's not that children are too challenging to work with, but rather it's that we don't know the right ways to understand. We don't have the right methods or the correct understanding to be able to understand how children are communicating their very specific design needs. So children who communicate non-verbally are always showing us what they think about different things, but it's us who need to learn how to listen a bit better and in different ways. So yeah, I think that's a kind of the responsibility there is on us as researchers, designers, innovators, teachers, to really think about what we could be doing to support children with different needs and abilities to be better included in design processes. And I think that there's just so much that children are telling us beyond words, which is kind of where this work's come from. So just a little note on terminology before I begin. I'll be talking about the children that I work with as children on the autism spectrum or autistic children, because those are the preferred terms in the communities of participants I was working with. There's obviously lots of debate on different types of terminology, which is usually very, very interesting to hear about. And I just wanted to sort of set the precedent by using this definition, which has been written by autistic individuals themselves, by the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. There's a really lovely longer version of this online if you'd like to look it up, but the way that they describe autism is as a neurological difference whereby we think differently, process our senses differently, move differently, communicate differently, socialize differently, and might need help with daily living. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is what I mean by minimally verbal. So this is quite clinical in a sense. To give you an idea, it's talking about people who communicate with either no spoken language at all, communicate with maybe certain words or phrases that are meaningful to them, or use things like echolalic language, where you would maybe repeat language from other places or other people, but not generate it. So other than those terms, I don't really go into diagnoses particularly, because I think that can be really deficit focused, and that's not really what we want to be thinking about in this work. And then I just wanted to talk about voice as well. feeling that there's these two different types of voice in this type of design where you're trying to understand what children are thinking about your designs. So PD, participatory design, often tries to sort of support voice or agency in design processes. But what does that mean when people don't communicate verbally? So voice can be discussed as verbal ability. So a friend of mine in Australia who's an autism advocate, Jackie Den Hooting, she says, a non-speaking autistic person will only stop being disabled by their environment when others learn to listen. And that's speaking about voice in the terms of having this verbal ability, but also putting the onus back on researchers and other people to be able to sort of really think about how we can be disabling people's environment. And then we also see that voice can have this other meaning of having agency and power. So Meryl Alper discusses that voice is this multidimensional social construct. So in design, assuming that we as researchers or designers can give voice is really quite problematic, because obviously it's not our voice to give. People already have this voice, but it's about understanding methods to support it to be heard. So that's a little bit of the framing. Oh, sorry, the last thing was as well, just this idea that children are already experts in their own forms of communication. Children already have so many different ways, and children, adults, anyone, have so many different ways of expressing what they want and need from technologies, or what they hope for from technologies. But again, that's really quite hard to listen to if we just use sort of these tried and tested methods, which aren't really applicable to these different contexts. And what do I mean by context? So just to give you an idea of where this work was being done, this was based on my PhD work, which I was doing in Australia with Jeremy. And the work was called CoDesign Beyond Words with Minimally Verbal Children on the Spectrum. Based in human-computer interaction, my background is was before that in psychology and in languages, and thinking about lots of different ways to bring those into support work. So I did a lot of hands-on support work with kids on the spectrum for years, which meant I was really interested in what technologies mean actually on the ground, and how can you implement them in a practical way into classrooms which are busy and quite chaotic at times. What does it mean to have these technologies and prototypes that we're developing just there? And so it lasted 4 years in an autism-specific primary school in Brisbane in Australia. And we developed a number of different digital and tangible technologies, and several different methodological and conceptual outputs, and I'll touch on a few of those as well today. So the overall research aim was to explore methods and technologies through which minimally verbal children on the autism spectrum can be supported to express themselves in co-design practice, and also in specific autism-specific school contexts. So not just about how children are expressing in the process of design, but what that means for their sort of sequential expression in the classroom afterwards or during. So I talked about co-design, I talked about participatory design. There's a bit of a problem with current mainstream co-design or participatory design approaches, which is that they really often rely quite heavily on these verbal interactions in order to be able to say that somebody's participated in co-design. So at the moment, a lot of methods would advocate for things like brainstorming, group discussions, concentrating on sort of these high level, quite high cognitive load activities, which just don't really align with the abilities of the children that I was working with. And while it works really well for verbal children on the spectrum, or verbal children in general, it doesn't really work with the kids I was working with, and it effectively excludes them from design conversations if all we want to do is be talking to them verbally and to be asking for their opinion verbally. It means that these children are further marginalized, particularly in technology design. So the question sort of became about how do we move towards ensuring that having a voice in design isn't solely for the verbal? And over time, and there's some other work in different types of papers on this, we kind of came to this feeling that there's these three different core parts of a person that need to be attended to first before you can get to this space to co-design beyond words. And these are designing technologies which are supporting children's sensory experiences, their own particular and individual strengths and interests, and their own unique forms of self-expression. And I'll go into that in a little minute as well. And then just to show just a little bit about the research, there's obviously a lot more work that can be added in here now, but just to show this funnel for the research gap, in that there's a lot of design that was being done for children on the spectrum, and really amazing work with things like augmentative and alternative communication devices, loads of assistive technologies. But those were really a lot of the time using predefined content that children didn't really have any control over in a lot of cases. Then bringing it into, okay, there's some co-design with verbal children on the spectrum. And then there's some co-design with verbal children on the spectrum that looks at strengths and interests, or maybe some of these things in more detail. But there wasn't really that much that was doing this sort of child-led, sensory, interest-based stuff that was looking at minimally verbal children on the spectrum's needs. So that's sort of where we positioned this work. And a little bit more about the context I was working in. So again, it was in Brisbane. It was working with the Autism CRC, Cooperative Research Centre, and the Autism Queensland School with children aged 4 to 8. And I was hugely lucky to get to go in, well, as often as I wanted, but usually it was once or twice a week over a course of 4 years, which I think anyone who's done any PD or co-design will know that's not really access that's really that readily available, which becomes a bit of an issue when you're trying to really build up these relationships and deep understandings of who a person is, but you've only got, 3 months as part of a funded project. So it's something I'm really interested in learning more about as well with other co-design projects. And then working with teachers, speech therapists, occupational therapists, other support staff, and working with 54 children over 4 years, but with some specific children who we worked with sort of followed through the school year, the school years. So a little bit of a flow of how things went. We spent a lot of time building relationships and sort of immersing ourselves in the context. Well, I say ourselves, this is mostly done quite solo. It was quite interesting because having a support work background, I think teachers give me a little bit of leeway and space to do things and support kids externally to the classroom, which was great. It meant I could really do this child-led stuff where children just took me by the hand and took me to different things that were engaging for them or interesting for them. So we had a really, really nice time just playing and learning about the child's everyday context. And then we sort of moved into this area where we're thinking a bit more about introducing more traditional sort of co-design materials or looking at different things from well-established groups in child-computer interaction, things like bags of stuff, loads of crafting materials, edging towards a bit more into what might technology do. Building some prototypes, developing things a little bit further. You might notice this dashing chap here was Jeremy. Jeremy built the tangible that I'm about to talk about later. So when he said I was partly responsible for him getting his PhD, he was like 50% responsible for me getting my PhD. But that's now gathering dust on a shelf in Brisbane somewhere, right? Yes, and then we moved into this sort of like iterative process of reflecting in the moment, and that was really enabled by having this really nice relationship with the school I was working with. I mentioned I'm going to mostly focus on the tangible stuff today, but I'll just touch on one of the digital things that we did. So the project sort of started off looking at how to exploring how to integrate children's strengths and interests into concrete digital prototypes, and how that might support self-expression in classrooms. So we made these 2 apps, which were really interesting because they were basically, they were very, very simple apps, just little audiovisual apps, which supported children to integrate their own pictures, images, and videos. And over time, they built up a calendar, for example, that showed what they were up to over their whole school year. Or in this one, they built a dictionary app. So dictionary apps are interesting because the idea is that it explores this words and images that are really important to children. So teachers were trying to support very young children to learn certain words, which were quite abstract. So they call them sight words like the, and, off. They don't really have a concrete meaning. And so we tried to find ways to make it more concrete and support children's learning. We thought, well, giving them their own app where they can decide what's important to them might be the start of that. So we use this example of, children are taught in school that A is for apple. But what if A for apple doesn't mean anything? It's not motivational to you. It's not one of your own strengths and interests, which are very specific when you're a child on the spectrum. What if A instead is for air conditioning unit, which it was for one of the girls we worked with. She loved air conditioning units. And it was quite nice because then some of the other letters got to become things like P for pipe or E for electric cable. You can see where you build up these meaningful little pockets of ideas that can expand into the child's learning in the classroom. And then the teacher was able to use these apps daily in the classroom to support the child's learning, and over time they built up. So that was quite a nice example of focusing on a child's strengths and interests and how that could be motivating in a learning context. But yeah, it sort of felt those were all based on sort of understanding what teachers thought. We did lots of interviews with teachers. We did interviews with parents. I observed what the children were doing with the apps, but it wasn't really about what the children were telling me. And for the second phase, we sort of realized it needs to be about what the children are saying, even if they're not verbally saying anything. So it got me thinking there's a bit of a methodological gap. What happens if you try to expand co-design methods to integrate non-verbal contributions? So this is what we want to do for the second part of this work, which was to explore what's happening in other disciplines. I mean, there's amazing practice stuff happening in, for example, speech and language therapy, or even in sort of different assistive therapies, but they're not really integrated into HCI. So we wanted to look at those. We also wanted to explore how we could better integrate children's senses into a technology, and we thought tangibles would be a nice avenue into that. And then we were interested in how to support diverse forms of self-expression. So rather than it always being about learning outcomes and things that are quantified, we thought, what's something that's a bit more personal, something like self-expression, which is hard to measure. And I don't know, it's quite hard to evaluate as well. It's something that we wanted to aim towards rather than just these quite strict learning goals. So we turn to this field of speech and language therapy. So here, if anyone's familiar with SLT, it's looking at really very practical approaches to understand the child's world and to have interactions in their world in ways that are child-led. So the key here is to follow the child's lead, not the adult's lead. And that means paying really, really close attention in a way that isn't really done in co-design in other contexts to what the child's doing, moving towards, looking at, pointing to. What are their actions or their interests or their motivations? And trying to understand what cues children are giving you, what they're moving towards, what it seems like might be engaging for them. And as a brief example, so this one here is called the OWL approach. These things sound so simple. This was basically just, if you're an adult interacting with a child who's not communicating verbally, to take the time to observe. So what they say that looks like noticing what the child's looking at, what they're pointing to, what they're reaching for. And then waiting gives you time to sort of observe the child's interest. You stop talking, you lean forward, you maybe look a bit expectant. So you can see it's all very embodied interactions that you're doing as well as the interacting partner. And then listening is this sort of paying very close attention to all the child's words and sounds. So it's a really I haven't got the date there, but it's a very old method. But we thought, let's play around with some of these small techniques that can be used in contexts to see what children might be saying beyond words. So this is just another thing that we thought was quite important. So something that's central to some of these concepts is these three pillars of communication. So joint attention is sharing a common focus with another and sort of sending messages about that focus. So that's pointing or making a noise about this thing. Turn taking is when each person has a turn at interaction, and it doesn't need to be speech, it can be anything. Like eye contact, body movement, things like that. And imitation is when you copy the other person's actions, movements, words, sounds. So with these sort of, as I say, quite simple concepts, we wanted to see how does that translate into HCI? How do we bring that back and fold it into the things that we know about interaction design? So we sort of identified it as a bit of an opportunity to integrate speech and language approaches with HCI approaches and to build a bit of a new approach. So we developed the CoDesign Beyond Words approach, which has these three phases. And there's a CAI paper on this if anyone's interested in reading more. So the foundation phase is about building an understanding of the child as they are. So the idea here is that the researcher is a sort of playful partner. You're going around, you're being led by the child. You're trying to build a deep understanding of who they are in their daily world. And in our context, it was in schools. So it's crucial, we think, in order to help us sort of understand their own unique strengths, interests, forms of self-expression, etc. And so you would do things like playing in the classroom, going outside, being led by the hand, being physically present in the child's life so that you're there to sort of build up this picture about who the child is on a foundational level. And it's also a space, if you're a researcher who hasn't done any of this speech and language therapy stuff before, to have a little practice of it. What does it mean to do this OWL stuff? And how can you think about using that when there's more design materials present, for example? And then the interaction phase is sort of where the co-design happens. So we thought this kind of happens in a cyclical process between interaction and reflection and action. So yeah, so the idea is that these are sort of action-based approaches that everything pivots on. So we're asking what's happening in the moment and looking for those three pillars of communication I mentioned. So turn taking, imitation, and joint attention, which are hard to notice if you don't sort of practice, because it really changes the level of interaction that you're looking at. You know, in sort of general co-design, things happen and they're very obvious that they're happening. Somebody says, I like that, or I don't like that. But in this context, the turn of a head could be the indication that I like that or I don't like that. And it's about moving things down to a more granular level and this micro interactional level to really understand what maybe children are telling us. So, and then also, yeah, this idea that we sort of step back, interactions might be happening, but it's also having that flexibility to step back and think what you can do to be able to maybe move towards more interaction. So reflecting in action, which is actually really difficult to do in the moment when you're also trying to maintain interaction with a child. And then reflection phase sort of occurs outside, not part of the design context, and the research team sort of reflecting on and determining next steps and what you can maybe bring in material wise to increase engagement and play more. So we thought when we sort of combine these things together, it might lead, if we are lucky, to these things that we've deemed moments of interaction. So this is what I was getting at with the sort of micro interactional stuff. So we defined these as instances of social connection, communication, or understanding between people. The micro instances in design in which minimally verbal children on the spectrum, or anyone who isn't communicating verbally, can convey meaning beyond words. So through their actions, their interactions, and their attentional foci. So we observe that these moments of interaction occur when children are supported to follow their interests, utilize their strengths. And we think these probably haven't really been that accessible through other co-design methods. So that might look like a moment of palpable excitement when you're interacting, or engagement. It's when sort of this joint attention, turn taking, imitation, they all come together. It could be things like passing an artifact to a peer, so that's turn taking. It could be paying attention to the same object as another, just eye gaze, joint attention. Or it could be attempts at words and sounds, so imitation. And we think that these moments of interaction are interesting or important because we see what the children's strengths are, how they navigate situations, how they interact. And by sort of reading, interpreting these, responding to these, we can sort of make moves and get towards a sort of deeper design context. So yeah, it's a bit abstract from design, but I will show you how it works in the moment with this example. So in this work, we explored loads and loads of different design avenues, but the one I would like to talk about is the tangible example, not least because Germany was a big part of it, but because it's a really nice example of something that really integrates all those sensory needs, strengths and interests, and self-expression, we think. So over time, I was sort of observing how children were interacting with different materials and objects, and seeing that children, usually when they were playing with balls, when they threw them or caught them or did anything with them, there was always accompanied by some sort of noise or utterance, not necessarily words, sometimes a word if a child had a few words, or sometimes not. And I thought that was quite an interesting thing to start to play around with. So we wanted to explore how maybe things like social interaction and self-expression might be supported by a tangible technology which could record and replay these things. So we created, first of all, this very LoFi prototype, just a pulsaring ball with a button speaker in it. And we let kids go for it and decorate it however they wanted. And we sort of interacted with these in different contexts. So this is a little example of how it works or how we felt that the CoDesign Beyond Words approach worked in context. So in the foundation phase, we got to know two children. One's Sam, he's 5, he is very good at counting, loves his hat. Joint attention can be a little bit challenging for him, and he's motivated by hearing his own name. So these are things that we learned while doing the foundation phase there. Chris is 5 and he uses 3 words, which are mum, door, and no. He uses a talker iPad, which is a assistive technology with a sort of PEX, picture exchange communications system app on it. He loves his Chewy toy, which is like a sensory feedback for his mouth. and he doesn't really interact with his peers too often. And then Alice is the occupational therapist. So I'm just using a few stills from the videos. So we did video interaction analysis for this work, which was really helpful in helping us code and understand what was happening at different moments on that sort of finer level. And these are some stills from it, and I'm going to read out the vignettes that we wrote about these. So the first phase is interaction. We begin the session by trying to engage both children's interest in the tangible prototype through verbally encouraging them to catch and throw to each other, saying, "Your turn, Sam," or "Catch, Chris." Both are disinterested, with Sam moving around the room and Chris flicking the light switches. Alice picks Sam up and brings him to the center of the room. His stature is floppy, his eyes moving around the room, clearly uninterested in the ball beside him on the floor. So reflection and action. The researcher reflects on the possibility that there were too many verbal cues happening by both adult participants, which might have been overwhelming. So through this sort of observe, wait, listen process, we realize maybe Sam wants an explicit cue. So she goes to the corner of the gym and records "Hello, Sam" in the speaker, because we realized that through the foundation phase that he's really motivated by hearing his own name. Sorry. So then we go back to interaction. Alice helps Sam hold the ball, and the researcher uses the hand over hand technique, another one from speech and language therapy, to take his finger and push the speaker with it. It says "Hello, Sam," and they observe, wait, listen to see what happens next. Moment of interaction. The ball says "Hello, Sam." Sam's posture immediately changes as he becomes alert and interested in the ball, joint attention. His eyes are fixed on it, holding onto it independently. He laughs and pushes the button again, this time without support. Imitation. It says "Hello, Sam," and he laughs again, looking at the researcher. This is followed by another moment of interaction. The researcher and Alice OWL to see what happens next. Chris now enters the video, engaged by Sam's laughter, and comes straight over to the ball, reaching out for it. Turn taking. "Does Chris want to go?" asks the researcher. Sam and Chris both press the speaker button simultaneously. Joint attention, imitation. Sam laughs as the ball says "Hello, Sam" again and again. And Chris looks at Sam as they press the button together, making his "oh" sound that we know from the foundation phase means that he's engaged. So just as a small example of how that might work in practice, but it shows you that sort of every sort of interaction being looked at and analysed on a different level might help us understand things that maybe we would just gloss over in other contexts. So the children showed us in those examples and through many other vignettes that we needed to have this focus on sort of personal and peer expression. And this is where we thought that the self-expression was really coming through. So in this example, we found these usability insights on things like tactile qualities that would suggest, for example, the ball should be squeezable rather than button activated. The children also showed us that they were really motivated by having these voices embodied in the ball, and particularly those of peers. And after that, also looking at the fact that paying attention to these moments of interaction, we can see ways to influence and support broader interactions with minimally variable children on the spectrum. So by doing this, we're creating these conditions for expression and interaction, but then we need to figure out how to embody those conditions in the next design. So you can see some other process of iteration into the tangible there. Yeah, and just to show how the prototype here developed. So this was the LoFi Prototype, which we played around with quite a lot in school and learned a lot. And then we moved on to the Wizard of Oz ball. So here we had the same concept, but we tried to bring it a little bit further on, having this sort of red space, which had Hessian on it, which was meant to look like a microphone. It had memory foam inside, it had LEDs, it had a Bluetooth speaker, it had other things that would help us sort of play around with these concepts, but they were all controlled through my phone. So it was great because it meant that we were able to play around with different forms of interaction. So for example, if the child touched it with his lips, I made it blue, but if he touched it with his hand, I made it green. And you can really play, I like the Wizard of Oz idea because you can play around with these things quite cheaply and iteratively as well. So next we had the high fidelity build, which Jeremy was part of helping me do. So this was essentially a squishy ball prototype. So the idea was children could record their different types of expressions or through which they could exhibit different expressions. So it produces audio, light, and it gives this sort of audio-visual sensory feedback. We want to put some sort of vibro-tactile stuff in it at some point, but we didn't get around to that, did we? So the idea was that it has an accelerometer in it. So when the child throws the ball, it would activate, and the child, whatever they had recorded in it, would be played as it rolled to the next person or to the teacher or just to themselves. And they can also squeeze it as well. So when they squeeze it, it would activate too. So we found this was quite engaging in terms of social interaction. And it was also really interesting to see the different embodied ways that children use the balls, lay on it, squished it, rolled it to each other, or chose not to, which was really quite revealing. So I've got another just quick example to tell you about this one of the ball in action. So I'm going to read this as well because it's another vignette. We trialed the ball with Liz and Rory in the outdoor play area, beginning with a simple game of rolling the ball to each other. Liz was sitting on the trampoline. She's disengaged and begins asking for Tom tea. So we know from the foundation phase, this is a favorite sensory item of hers, a t-shirt with Thomas the Tank Engine on it, and where the image is made from this sort of rubbery material. And she likes to scratch the material to get sensory stimulation, and she likes the feeling of the friction on her fingernails. So we asked Rory what he'd like to record, and he looks at Liz and he says, Thomas t-shirt. So we record this in the ball and throw it to Rory, who laughs when it plays back his voice. It's quite engaging in that sense. And then he rolls it to Liz, who looks up at him for the first time as it activates the recording, and she hears Rory's voice saying Tom T. So she looks at Rory and the researcher and repeats the phrase triumphantly, Thomas t-shirt, an exclamation rather than a question. She drapes the Thomas t-shirt over the ball and scratches it, smiling. So lots of things at play there, but some things we were looking at was Rory showing us he's really aware of his social surroundings. He's seeing that we're keen to engage Liz, and he can have the power to record one of her favorite sayings, and he knows what her favorite thing is, which is this Thomas t-shirt, which is amazing. And this in turn brought Liz's attention to the game, and she sort of took turns and showed us this joint attention, and even sort of did this embodied integrating of her t-shirt onto the ball. So we thought the ball was quite helpful in that sense of supporting the children to engage around a sort of shared point of mutual interest. I'm not going to go into this loads today, but from that work, we sort of built up this framework, modalities of self-expression, and over on the furthest column there, you can see these 6 modalities of self-expression that we thought were really quite interesting to look at in more detail. If anyone was co-designing in these contexts, these things to be aware of. And, you know, it's absolutely not exhaustive because there's so many other modalities that we use to express, but it's a nice start maybe in thinking about the types of things that might be useful if anyone else was to go into a co-design context and try to do this stuff beyond words. But the key here, so I think, is this looking at the minimally verbal interaction on this finer level of granularity, and looking and understanding that, you know, the turn of a head or a quiet utterance can be as important as, you know, a big loud exclamation or a word or an agreement in verbal communication. And the key is understanding that interaction in this context is just very different, and changing our perspective on what it means to interact could really help us understand a little bit more about what children want from technology. And obviously these are just first steps towards this. And another step I'm trying to do at the moment is bring this all together into this CoDesign Beyond Words framework. An absolute work in progress at the moment, but the idea is just to present something a little bit useful, maybe, in helping us to think about what could we do if we wanted to go into a more than verbal context. And more than verbal, of course, not just being in a neurodiverse context, more than verbal being basically any context in which a human interacts, because we're all, I mean, I do it all the time with my hands. We're always interacting. I mean, no, it's not a bad thing. I'm going to keep doing it. But we're always interacting in these more than verbal ways. But it's about understanding what people are communicating that way. Yeah, so I won't go into that in detail, but if you're interested, do let me know. I'm trying to refine this at the moment, so it'd be nice to chat if anyone's interested. And then I just thought I'd touch on what's happening next. So that work was done during my PhD, as I said, interested in moving things forward as well here, while also looking at these new emerging contexts. So where is the child in AI design is this question we've been asking quite a lot recently. Obviously, AI is a huge topic. Anyone who was at CHI this year will see every second stream was basically AI themed, which is really interesting. So particularly with kids, though, they're if AI is in their lives and it's proliferating in them, but are kids involved in its design? Not often, it doesn't seem. We're trying to look at the minute about how children might be designed about, then designed for, designed with, and are they ever going to get to design and lead it? That's really quite hard to do. I mean, you maybe have seen the UNICEF AI policy guidelines on the development of AI, and it's quite interesting that they talk about how all children should be involved in the design of AI in some sense, which is quite a tall order, but really interesting as a provocation to think about, yeah, how do we integrate children's insights into the design of AI? That's another thing I'd love to talk about if anyone's interested. Obviously, I'm also interested in where is the minimally variable child in AI design. So if any children aren't really involved in the process of design of AI, it's highly likely that minimally variable children are almost completely left out of that conversation. And that's really important because what about things like conversational agents? You know, what does it mean for a person to interact with a conversational agent when they don't communicate through conversations that are verbal? And these are some of the most common forms of AI that are present maybe in children's lives, like Siri and Alexa and things like that. What does it mean to have these easy to engage with sort of technologies, but when you can't use the modality that's being suggested that you use? So yeah, going forward, looking at sort of these embodied, tangible, multisensory explorations of how that might look instead, or as well as, and thinking about how intelligent systems might be a bit more physical, digital, multimodal. And to think about this, sorry, this last bit I said here was one thing I think is a nice way to do this is to do some speculative design with kids on AI futures. So I've been doing a little bit of work at the Glasgow Science Centre with families about speculative design on AI education futures, which is all just happening at the minute. So I don't have lots to share with you, but there's just some images there of some work we were doing around how would AI impact your school life in the future? How could AI make learning more fun in the school in the future? You know, it's not always the doom and gloom. There's lots of potential there, and I think children are really just the perfect participants for speculative design because they are so amazingly imaginative. So we've been having a lot of fun in those workshops, and hopefully have more to share soon on those. And one of the other things we did was develop these this toolkit to sort of support expression. This isn't just in minimally variable context. This is a general toolkit that I wanted to design just to bring along when you go to participatory design as something to point at and play around with. So it's turned out into this CoDesign Stories workshop toolkit. These are just from the mural, but this is the kind of the main board here, which I've got 5 or 6 of them designed and delivered. They're kind of like a board game-esque tool that I'd be happy to share if anyone's doing any workshops on kids that they'd be interested in using something sort of physical to frame any design work around. The idea is that they're there to be shared and used around among the community and anyone interested in child-computer interaction. Oh yeah, and I've been doing other things as well, working with older adults, really quite interested in intergenerational design and how to integrate some of this work with kids, with older adults. A few different things I've been doing at Design Informatics Lab in University of Edinburgh around care, around exploring informal networks of care and thinking about how we might use different tools to support people to express around their care. Totally unrelated to this talk, but just so you know, that's something that we're working on as well up there. And with that, yeah, I'm really at that sort of stage looking at collaborating with anyone who's interested in these topics. It's all really early stages, so any input is much appreciated. And if you'd like to collaborate on anything that I've talked about, let me know. These are some of the papers that we talked about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, hands already. All right, I'll just move to questions.
Hi, Martin from UCLIC and PALS. Wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, have you looked into adjunct mental health challenges? So, for example, we are neighbors in that field, for example, social anxiety, and autism spectrum is a high overlapping field, and when you're already talking about collaborations, I can see something growing out of this overlap. So yeah, have you looked into how to design with social anxious ones? Because especially in children and adolescencehood, social anxiety is growing.
Yeah, thank you. Nice question. And yeah, I agree, definitely adjacent / overlapping areas. The children I've been working with, we don't really go into the details of their co-occurring conditions, because a lot of the time there are so many. And I think particularly with minimally verbal children, there's a real, and this is just my own sort of anecdotal thoughts on it, but it seems like there's space, there's not the diagnosis, because there's, you know, the tools that are used to diagnose are based on verbal responses as well. So it's again about how do you understand if a child who's not communicating verbally also is socially anxious, for example. I think that's a really interesting question and something to think about.
Very interesting, especially when it comes to because I think it is very interesting when you talked about the fact about communication, for example, coming from the social anxiety perspective. Not many children, adolescents, they don't know how to communicate about their anxieties, for example, or they don't want to talk about these anxieties, and so they stay hidden and behind the curtain, and these anxieties turn into more severe mental issues. And so and now adding on top other challenges to their life, I think it is very interesting. It's like trying to give them a voice could be a very interesting, challenging project for these special needs to their table.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to talk about if you could. I was going to do over here as well.
Thank you for sharing your work with us, and I found it really interesting, like that you said, you know, you had the permissions and access with the population, and I can see how valuable that was. But I'd love to hear more about how you got those permissions and like the ethics, because I think sometimes when we're doing work with populations that are potentially, say, deemed vulnerable or unable to consent, like how did you circumnavigate those kind of issues?
Good. Yeah. So it's all luck, basically. Starting my PhD at a time when we had built this collaboration with the autism CRC. So this was set up as part of this PhD project, which had been advertised. So I was really lucky to come in when those things had been taken off the ground. And as part of the autism CRC, there were different partners, and one of the partner organizations was a set of schools. So in that sense, I walked into it. In another, I went through a really long ethics process to make sure that everything was covered to the best of our abilities. So we went through a couple of different, and Australia is slightly different, ethical processes, but we had access from that sense, but access is different from ethical approval, obviously. And I think what was really something that I really want to take forward is this idea of sort of, Katha Spiel talks about like participatory evaluation. And I think participatory consent is something that's really important to think about as well. So if you imagine, like in a lot of work, children are just part of this part of it in the middle, which is the design work where it's all happening, and you can get the cute photos, etc. But what happens afterwards with the technology? Okay, maybe they're involved in an evaluation, but what happens beforehand as well is really important. And how do you explain to funders that you need a year in advance, because you need time to understand these children and you need time to figure out how to involve them in consent processes, for example. We did have child-friendly consent forms. We had discussions with teachers where they were explaining things, but whether that's understood on the same level is a really big question. I think there's loads of research that could be done there.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Like you said, it's really important to involve them before you actually even start the research, and how, yeah, so no, I mean, how you get funders to understand that might be, an interesting conversation we can have.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Cara, for your talk. I wanted to ask you about ownership, like experience of ownership as a designer, as a young 4-year-old, 5-year-old designer, perhaps. Given that you followed some of these kids throughout several years, I was wondering if you had any insights around whether their ownership over the design processes was shaped or expressed in some way by the children involved. And I understand that some of these children might have only said 3 words, but was there something in the bodily expression that indicated that you showed some really nice data about engagement and like that positive experiences like joint attention coming from that interaction with those objects that you designed. But overall, would you have any sort of, would be really curious to hear about any experiences you might have had with this particular group of children?
Thank you. Ownership is such an interesting question. Yeah, I think it seems a little bit like ownership and agency are very intertwined, and agency is so hard to define, never mind measure. And so I think that, yeah, it's something that needs a lot more work on. But from the small examples that we have there, I could just talk about when we would start with this polystyrene ball, for example, and it's just blank. And kids would come in and start maybe drawing on it or sticking stickers on it, and then over time that becomes their ball. So there's that sense of, I would just bring this huge bag of everyone's different balls and they would rummage and find theirs. And so, I mean, that was really nice because you don't know in the process of doing it, are you just interacting with this because it's there, because this is the one that I'm presenting? But over time, when they became these personalized items, albeit just polystyrene with a button speaker, but when they were all mixed up together, kids would always go and find theirs. And that's like a common practice in school. You hang your bag on your own peg and you have your desk, and school's quite ownership focused in that sense of space in an embodied sense. So yeah, I guess with the immediate prototypes, I could see ownership, but then whether children could abstract, because I mean, in autism, they talk about abstraction of thought being quite challenging at times, and whether there was that abstraction to then go, oh, okay, then that's the bigger, because then it became the high fidelity prototype and there was just one of that. So is that connected to like understanding that was mine, which the children
Firstly, thank you so much for the talk. It's really important work. I was really struck by what you said about deficits and how that applies within a clinical context. So I guess I have a kind of 2-part question, which is, one, do you think most technology is designed with to support children, autistic children is designed with deficits in mind? And also, I guess, do you have any recommendations about how to avoid co-designing for deficits?
That's a huge question. I guess so. Yeah, I think a lot of technology. Well, there's technology that's designed in a research academic context, and then there's technology that's designed elsewhere. And I would say, broadly speaking, a lot of the stuff that's designed out there with academia can be very, very deficit focused, unless it's specifically saying we're being assistive technology or we're being this. So all other general technology, it's a very sweeping statement, but it can be deficit focused because it's going, what is the problem here and how do we fix this with technology? So many inverted commas, like it's just too much. I'm sure there are amazing examples out there of that not happening, but that's the thing when things are being made for profit. And then there's what's happening in academia, which is more nuanced and increasingly more focused on positive aspects. There's a lot of debate around whether just focusing on strengths and interests means that you're ignoring more challenging issues, but I think you can get that balance of them. And I just think, the way that you choose to describe somebody or a context is so powerful. And if you're just saying problems with this, challenge with this, etc., it seeps into the way that you do your work. And so I always try to zoom out from that a little bit. And I think advice-wise, I don't know. This is, as I say, this is all stuff I want to keep working on and moving forward with. And I guess finding new ways to listen is probably very broad, but I think that's one thing I would definitely say is important. Just in other disciplines, they're really good at this, but HCI, it's kind of in this unique position where you can take things from other places and you can import them, and it's new here because that's not been applied to tech before. So it's quite nice to be able to go, look, that's been working over there for hundreds of years. Let's think about it in this context. Just being with kids, doing what they do, getting on the floor, crawling around, like being open to looking silly is like number one thing that I came to understand, which is fun as well. So yeah, I think it's about abandoning a bit of like research brain and just going what's happening in the moment in front of you, which is really hard when you've got funding deadlines and you've got to write the paper and all that kind of stuff. I find the tensions are really quite interesting between being the researcher and then being in the moment with the child.
Any questions? So thank you again, Cara, for coming to speak to us today about your research. So, round of applause.
Thank you.
So I believe that after this, people are going out for drinks because we're also celebrating Tiggy's completing his Viva today, which is fantastic. And then a few of us going out to dinner. If you'd like to join us, we're going to the Busu Bar. The Thai restaurant just around the corner. So if you'd like to join me, we've got a couple of seats available, which would be great. And if you want to get to know Cara more, or talk about her research more, it's a good opportunity to do that there. And next week, Marta is giving a presentation. It's also a strike day. So getting in, if you're living outside of London, getting in may be difficult, but if you are living in London, if you could come along and support, that'd be fantastic. That's all. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Oh, I got a question online. Hang on.
Online?
Yeah.
Ah.
Do you want to answer it?
Sure.
The question is, because you're still live.
Oh,
you're still
right.
on. It's from Belen Barros Penna, who's asking, could her design approach extend to non-verbal autistic adults, or would it need to be adapted? A lot of technology and design work around autism focus on children, and approaches are not always applicable to adults. As a result, autistic adults remain under-researched and a little abandoned.
Oh, that's a great question, Belen. Thank you. I don't know if can you still hear me? Could you?
Still online.
Still online. Okay, great. I'll just.
Maybe.
So yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree. I think that. Yeah, it's really difficult because there's always certain little pockets that get more attention, and I think with this kind of work, it seems like. Originally it seems, or like, at first glance it seems like it's maybe more applicable to children because it's very play-based, explorative, in ways that sometimes adults aren't really given the credit for being playful or excited and exploring things. But I think this is very applicable in other ways. Maybe change the type of maybe the framing of the design work or the materials that you use would be adaptable to work with adults. I don't know what that would look like, but I think that the core of this is just understanding interaction on a deeper level than currently is. And I think in autism that's really necessary, and I think it could be really interesting to do with older adults, autistic adults. Yeah, it'd be great to chat to you about that, actually. I think, you're doing this project with John, right? John Vines. I think, is that right? I think so. But yeah, no, it'd be lovely to chat further about that, because what I'd love to do is take this out into other contexts and try it out. There's lots of other ways that we can look at the way that people are communicating in different ways.
Excellent. And one last question. This is from Antonella Nonis, who met you at CHI 2019. And their PhD was also on novel tangible user interfaces to support nonverbal autistic children, social play and self-regulation.
Yeah.
And they're interested to know what you think about whether we are analyzing and or evaluating the success of an intervention, an approach, a technology too much on the base of what a neurotypical play is manifested, instead of looking at what forms of diverse types of play could be manifested in terms of perceived fun and benefits for these children.
Sorry, can you go back to the question?
Yeah.
That is a really nice question, Antonella. I remember meeting you and we talked about the I've forgotten the name of it now, but this is your amazing tangible tech. It was like white, fluffy, and kids could lie on it, and it was really cool. I've definitely cited your work because it's awesome. And I think you're absolutely right. And neurotypical play looks different from play in autism context. And that is a really nice way to put it, actually, to explain that actually fun or benefit or expression looks different in these types of contexts. And Yeah, I think that could be a really nice area to look at in detail and go, not a comparison necessarily, because I don't know if comparisons are ever really beneficial in these contexts, but more looking at, okay, laughter and running might not be the thing that a child is having fun with. It might be something completely different, like having a repetitive motion with their fingers or those types of things. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about that if you'd be interested. Please drop me a wee email, because I think that's thinking about it, play in those contexts is always going to be, some of it really applies and some of it doesn't, and I think it all comes down to the individual child, which is really what this work's trying to get at.
All the online questions coming at the end.
Sorry, can I just stand up because I got sore back?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is from Yingjing Yu, who's thank you for your time. I'm interested in the tangible toolkits for supporting co-design, since my master's dissertation has a similar theme. What do you think is the greatest benefit of these tangible toolkits for minimal verbal participants in co-design? I feel pity that I can't make to attend this in person.
Oh, yeah, no, sorry you're not here too, but I haven't tried these toolkits yet with minimally verbal kids. I just designed them based on the work that we've been doing, and then they're just a sort of early prototype anyway. So they're open to being integrated into lots of different design projects. That's why I was hoping that they might be useful, not just with children, but with adults as well. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but if you wanted to drop me an email, please feel free, because I'm good to start finding ways to get those out to people. They're very heavy, so they're going to be expensive to post. I need to figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
But thanks for your question.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Like Cara said, if you want to get in touch with her, just email. And I'm going to stop it now. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.